Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. James Costa. He is Executive Director of the Highlands Biological Station and Professor of Evolutionary Biology at Western Carolina University. His many interests include insect behavior and ecology, environmental history and philosophy, conservation biology, and the history of science. And today we're going to focus mostly on Charles Darwin, Alfred Russel Wallace, on the origin of species, and because this year marks the 150th anniversary of the publication of The Descent of Man, also we're going to focus a lot on that book. So, Dr. Costa, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Oh, a great pleasure. Thanks so much, Ricardo.
Okay, so first of all, let's talk a little bit about on the origin of species. So, how revolutionary was this book in the overall picture of evolutionary biology and evolutionary theory?
Well, I mean, that book did mark a seismic shift, in the understanding of the nature of diversity, biological diversity, even touching on, the nature of humanity, which of course was a very delicate topic, as you can imagine, not one that Darwin directly addressed to any significant extent in the origin, but absolutely represented a seismic shift, mainly because of the just compelling mass of lines of evidence that Darwin was able to bring to bear to make an argument for this idea of species change. It might be useful to point out that Darwin didn't originate the idea of species change, what we call evolution, and he and his contemporaries knew as transmutation. This had been an idea that had been discussed. A couple of centuries, before Darwin, but there was never any, truly compelling mechanism or, systematic analysis of how this could occur. And so it was generally considered to be just not a very credible hypothesis. And in fact, maybe contrary even to the received kind of, let's say, wisdom in a religious context of the day.
So, I mean, what were the things that Darwin brought to the table that really gave credence to this idea?
Well, Darwin's approach, he had kind of patiently, worked out, trying to ferret out lines of evidence, on this idea that species may change, and then secondarily on the idea that species change through a particular mechanism that he had discovered, co-discovered, we might say, natural selection. He thought that you should be able to make sense of patterns that you can observe in the natural world. So he had two tasks before him. One of those was to build a case for the reality of this process or this mechanism of natural selection. And the ingredients there were to try to understand the nature of variation, especially heritable variation, and also the idea of what they called in those days the struggle for existence, population pressure, differential survival and reproduction. And putting these together gives you a kind of natural selection dynamic, a process that I think it's fair to say Darwin sort of borrowed from his insight into seeing what humans could achieve through what we now call artificial selection. So he has a mechanism in place, and if this is real, then in principle you should be able to bring that to bear to make sense of empirically observable patterns in a number of aspects of the natural world. For example, you should be able to make sense of observable behaviors, patterns of hybridization, successes and failures of hybridization, the geological record, looking at the fossil record and geological succession, biogeographical distribution. It should be able to then help you understand why you have such interesting patterns in comparative morphology, why embryology, can give you certain insights into relationships of species, why the why the species classification system that was used works so well, this hierarchical classification from species to genera, families, etc. All of these naturally falling out of a process of a branching evolutionary tree over time. So Darwin's working method was to really ferret out and often simultaneously working on different fronts, gathering evidence to make a compelling case that his idea of species change and the mechanism of natural selection really, those were the only ways you could make sense of the different kinds of patterns that are observable in these otherwise rather disparate areas. And took him quite a long time, but that method is, I think, built into the very physical structure of On the Origin of Species, the way the very chapters are laid out in that book.
So maybe we could say that one of the things that made Darwin's case so strong was the fact that he collected evidence from many different sources and he made sort of a case of cumulative evidence, right?
Yes, yes. I mean, I think that it's fair to say that that is what made this so convincing, that the idea of species change. However, I think it's also fair to say that his contemporaries were not necessarily so convinced by his proposed mechanism of natural selection. I mean, even some of his closest supporters kind of vacillated on, could this process really be responsible? But the idea of species change, I think it is fair to say that he made a very compelling case. Then the debate was really over, just what is that mechanism? And of course, he continued to champion natural selection for years after that.
Mhm. But we also have Wallace that co-discovered this theory. But was there something in Darwin that was original and we can't really find in Wallace, for example?
Mm. There is. I mean, there are some really broad and striking parallels, and I find it very interesting that Wallace and Darwin independently, once they had this idea of species change, seem to intuitively have a sense of the kinds of observations, the kinds of lines of evidence one might seek out to try to make a compelling case. Wallace sort of came to the mechanism of selection a bit late in that process. And I think in broad terms, we can see the similarities in terms of a recognition of the importance of heritable variation, a recognition of the importance of population pressure, that struggle for existence, the idea that this gives rise to a dynamic of essentially a differential survival and reproduction dynamic that pushes populations and species to change in response to the environment. And of course, Wallace did not use the term natural selection. We know that Darwin coined that term, and Wallace had developed his ideas independently of Darwin. So he never came up with a name for this mechanism, but it was very clear the nature of the mechanism. So far, so good with the similarities of their processes. But Darwin, he had come to his idea of natural selection fairly early on. Let's say it was about 1838. And it took him quite a while to actually gain some insight into a particular aspect of the selection dynamic that was to him, extremely important, very important. And this is an aspect that Wallace did not have at all. And that is the mechanism that Darwin called his principle of divergence. And the principle of divergence is an interesting idea where he's actually looking at really competition pressure, right? Competition between very closely similar variants, variations, maybe varieties of species, in such a way that those that are too severely and directly competing would inevitably, one or the other would inevitably be displaced. But he saw that there was a process where the principle of divergence would encourage, on average, the slightly more divergent variants that would be competing less directly to persist, to survive and reproduce on average longer. And in that way, he saw this as a force almost, a process to not just result in species change, which can be very linear, but for species to change in a tree-like fashion. It would actually force lineages apart, and you would get branches upon branches upon branches. And he saw this as an extremely important insight into giving rise, helping to explain, first of all, the tremendous diversity of life that we see in big continental areas, and also to try to explain the nested hierarchy of the tree of life. And this is important because if you think about it, the kinds of evolutionary models that were bandied about before Darwin, maybe most famously by the great Lamarck, they're very linear. Species A maybe gives rise to B, gives rise to C, gives rise to D. Later on, Lamarck did have some sense of how you might get some branching, but it seemed to be secondary and very limited. Darwin's vision was quite different, seeing this intrinsic process of a forced branching. And also, because it's compelled by the environment and other species and variants that are present, there is no expectation of symmetry. The branching tree of life can be quite asymmetric. Different lineages can change to different degrees, or maybe not at all. You can have the so-called living fossils, as we would call them today, not a term that Darwin used. Like a coelacanth, for example, that looks, seemingly modern ones look little different from the ones we see in the fossil record. But he could explain all of these different patterns that you can see through this principle of divergence or divergence of character, which is fundamentally an ecological process. And I do believe it's fair to say that that Wallace did not have any such process in his theory.
But with the ideas that were already in the air before Darwin published On the Origin of Species and even around that time of its publication, would you say that it was fairly inevitable that someone would have arrived at the same ideas even if we didn't have Darwin or Wallace?
Mm. Well, almost certainly. I mean, eventually, I mean, scientific ideas, insights into the natural world, inquiring minds will discover these things, it may have taken a bit more time. I think it is discussed and debated, among historians and philosophers, to what extent the particular circumstances of sort of industrial revolution aged England and a certain, kind of cultural context of conversations about processes, mechanization, maybe even population pressure, kind of competition, those sorts of forces that were going on. Maybe helped kind of create a certain climate for these ideas where a Darwin or a Wallace might begin to connect these dots. They weren't uniquely suited to this, and I think that there were other thinkers like Edward Blythe who, were sort of in that same, frame of mind. Certainly, the idea of a compelling model of a branching process of transmutation would have been hit upon, and natural selection, by another name, a process that we could recognize as driving that process, would have been discovered. How soon after? Of course, who knows? But I dare say, almost certainly within that century, I would think.
So before we get into the Descent of Man, which is the book I would like to focus most on today, what were some of the questions that were left unanswered in The Origin of Species?
Well, hmm. I mean, there are quite a few, of course. I mean, ever since Darwin, there's been, as you know, I mean, there's, almost every chapter of the book is its own, field of research today, and building upon and sometimes correcting, errors or misunderstandings, or coming to see lines of evidence that Darwin interpreted one way, seeing them in a different way, in the light of other evidence and other ways, other frameworks that we have to think about things. So I guess it should be borne in mind that modern evolutionary biologists, they would consider themselves to be, sort of in a technical sense, more neo-Darwinians than Darwinians, right? Because we can recognize that Darwin himself, there were certain limitations, and for example, little understanding of heredity. You don't need to understand modern genetics to understand natural selection, but it certainly helps an awful lot to gain insight into different kinds of genetic variation and the way that genetic variation is generated, and the way that it can be spread through populations. Also, Darwin. This principle of divergence that we discussed a moment ago, really Darwin's vision was very much one that we would label today as a process of sympatric speciation, driving species diversity within common geographical areas, because he put such a premium on competition. Modern biologists would disagree with that. Now we see allopatric speciation, the idea of physical separation of populations and allowing them to diverge in isolation as much, much more important. So there were unanswered questions about the dynamic of speciation. Of course, Darwin had some sense of the fossil record, but also lamented the great gaps in the record. So there were a lot of unanswered questions about linking forms and filling in gaps in the tree of life. And paleontology has been a thriving science since even before Darwin, and that work has continued and has filled in a lot of the uncertainties that existed in Darwin's day. And there are many other examples as well, of course.
So then we get into the descent of man. Were there any particular reasons why Darwin wrote this book? Did he have any specific goals in mind?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. Why 12 years after the origin of species does Darwin publish the Descent of Man? Famously, Darwin was very reticent about addressing humans in the origin. And I sort of joke with my students that he knew he was in enough trouble as it was. He didn't want to, get into even, more hot water by discussing, humans. But he did mention, sort of, he's being a bit coy, that light would be thrown, or much light would be thrown on the origin of man, in the origin. But others, of course, they immediately recognized this has profound implications for humans. And this has profound implications for the way we humans in our societies, the way we think about ourselves, our origin, the nature of humanity. It has theological and philosophical and ethical implications beyond just the scientific, the paleontological questions. And so some of Darwin's contemporaries did not shy away from exploring human origins. And so I speculate that Darwin, he had long had a very particular idea about not simply human origins, but the origin of human diversity. By which I mean sort of what would have been called in his day, and maybe to some extent today, racial diversity, ethno-racial diversity. And he had a very particular model that I think he probably knew would be a tough sell. And that model was sexual selection, right? So, since before Darwin, of course, going back to Linnaeus and probably before Linnaeus, the relationship between humans and other primates was very clear, right? Anatomically, it's absolutely clear. And Linnaeus was well aware of that. It's the way he classified humans along with these other primates. You could easily course, interpret this in an evolutionary way, a la Darwin. You can think about, we share common ancestry with these earlier primate forms. So that in itself wouldn't have been so novel for Darwin to discuss, and it was something that others like Huxley were discussing. But what would have been very novel was this idea of explaining this kind of racial diversity and even sexual diversity, gender differences, not just in humans, but throughout the animal kingdom through this process of sexual selection. And so the Dissent, which was really quite a sizable tome, it was pitching an argument really not so much to argue for a primate origin of humans. That would have been a given, but really to make a case for the role of sexual selection and human diversification. And you can see in the very structure of the Dissent how he is making a case for that by doing a kind of survey of sexual selection and sexual dimorphism and such in the animal kingdom. So it's almost like two books in one, where he introduces, human origins, long section on sexual selection in the animal kingdom, and then applies that idea to humans. And that's really the novelty of that book.
Mhm. So this primate origin of humans, I mean, it was something that people already knew before the descent of men?
Well, they knew, certainly, even naturalists who accepted the prevailing sort of natural theology, paradigm, and were not evolutionists, would have recognized the relationship. How you explain the relationship is what differs, right? So clearly, in a creationist context, humans were simply created clearly on this kind of primate body plan, and we don't know why. I mean, we don't know, what the plan of the creator might be in that context, let's say. But there wouldn't have been any question about the relationship. We are anatomically, any competent comparative anatomist would have and did recognize that relationship. But how you explain that, the common ancestry idea, right, the evolutionary idea, would have come from Darwin. Lamarck had his own idea. His model of evolution was not one of branching series of common ancestors, but more a kind of linear, parallel series of linear tracks of change. But nonetheless, even in Lamarck's model, he would have seen, let's say, contemporary great apes as proto-humans that, given a certain amount of time, presumably millions of years, they too would eventually become human. So that was never, denied, even by, I think, the most ardent and committed religious thinkers of the time. I don't think that was the tough sell, but to say that we originated, rather than being created, to originate in a physical sense from primate ancestors through transmutation. Now that would have been contrary to, the received scriptural wisdom and would have flown in the face of theology. And that's where, any naturalist holding that idea would have gotten a lot of pushback on, like Darwin did.
Mhm. And what about the idea that we originated in Africa? Was that something that Darwin came up with, or was it already discussed by other people?
That it was debated. I believe it was debated at the time. And Darwin, he did believe that modern humans have their origin in Africa, and that was not based on fossil evidence, right? There was no really known, hominid, evidence at that time. In fact, it was, really only around the 1850s into the 1860s that Neanderthal people were being described, although still not recognized as perhaps a distinct species. But rather, I think that it was really on the basis of the fact that all of the other great apes, right? The so-called higher primates, which would have been our closest relatives, all occur in Africa. Well, chimpanzees and gorillas occur in Africa, right? And orangutans, of course, in Southeast Asia. But I think it was on the basis of the proximity of our nearest relatives.
Mhm. But back then, did we already have a good enough picture of the sort of phylogenetic relationships that could have been there? I mean, the ways we were probably related to other species like chimpanzees, gorillas, and others.
Well, I don't know. It's a good question. Certainly, there was detailed comparative anatomical analysis done, and debated which would be most closely related to humans. Um, there were speculations about origins in Asia because orangutans occur there. Also, the idea, and I think that Ernst Haeckel and others held this idea, the idea that maybe there was a lost continent, that maybe humans had their origins in a place that no longer exists. And there was a notion now thought to have been kind of misguided, that lemurs, for example, recognized as a rather kind of basal or primitive kind of primate, existed not just in Madagascar, but also in Southeast Asia. And this turns out to be an error. But at the time, there was this idea that if you link those regions, that there could have been a kind of landmass occupying part of the present-day Indian Ocean. And I believe that Haeckel, or perhaps others in his day, actually called that Lemuria. It was the lost continent of Lemuria, where these primate ancestors existed. And he speculated that humans actually had their origin in this lost land, rather than Africa per se or Asia per se.
Mhm. So, apart from ideas like sexual selection and trying to explain human biodiversity and, I mean, probably human origins, what were some of the other ideas presented by Darwin in the book?
In the Descent, in the
Hmm.
Descent of Man.
Yes.
Um, well, it's interesting. Descent, sexual selection, which is another of these ideas that Darwin had hit upon fairly early, that others like Wallace, had not really thought about. He early on he had this sense of the importance of sexual selection in generating sexual dimorphism, and so we see he alludes to this in the origin, but then in Descent really develops this idea and recognizing right away the two fundamental forms of sexual selection, where you have a kind of intrasexual selection, a kind of male-male competition dynamic, and often resulting in the evolution of structures that could be aids in that kind of combat, whether it's like enlarged canines and antlers and those sorts of things, versus intersexual selection, and this idea of female choice or male choice in generating the evolution of secondary sexual characters in a variety of species, looking at insects and other arthropods, looking at fish, looking at birds, looking at reptiles, and of course mammals, including primates and humans among them. So that was a tremendous insight and contribution that Darwin had. But there are even elements of that are still being discussed and debated today. And specifically, that is what I'm alluding to is Darwin's idea that when it comes to intersexual selection, that this can be driven by little more than aesthetic choice. That this doesn't have to be necessarily based on what we would call today fitness. It can be simply the whims of taste and fashion of males for certain characters of females for certain characters of males. And that remains an interesting, point of some discussion today.
Mhm. And when it comes to human biodiversity, he thought about race as a real biological entity, correct?
Yes, I mean, I think that's fair to say, a biological entity. I mean, Darwin, I think, like so many of his day, of course, he is who he is, right? He definitely has an ethnocentric, Eurocentric, um, view of the world, and so he sees other groups of people in terms of a kind of natural hierarchy, differing degrees of achievement of, whatever it might be, some level of cultural complexity or whatever you might call it. And and it's easy to see that as kind of, especially perhaps in the 19th century, this time of where inevitably any idea of an evolutionary change is inevitably seen in the context of progress, of a kind of hierarchy, of kind of changing for the better somehow. And there's a tendency to naturally see things in hierarchical terms. Darwin, at times in his writing, tried to sort of fought with himself to try to get out of that mindset. Not necessarily just in the context of humans, but in general. Like we have this sloppy way of talking about higher and lower species, and that's really rather an erroneous way of thinking about the nature of diversity. Prokaryotes are they are exquisitely complex in their own way. We can't say that they're lower than an amphibian or something. But nonetheless, there was this tendency to see things in hierarchical terms. And in Darwin's case and others, that would be true of human societies and human ethno or racial groups as well.
Mhm. But he also speculated a bit on some of the evolutionary origins of psychological traits, correct?
Yes, yes. I mean, Darwin, he wanted to understand. I mean, if you start from the idea that, humans are organisms, and admittedly, humans are pretty interesting, very special organisms. We do truly amazing things. I mean, we recognize the just the astounding capacities of our minds, but we also have this kind of culture, and we have language, and we have this diversification of language and culture, and we're inventive, and we do all of these amazing things. How do how can we explain the cultural in the context of the biology? And that's very, very difficult. And Darwin tried to do that in the context of mind. I mean, he of course believed that, and this is reasonable, right? That mind is part of body. I mean, it is part of our biology. How it arises, how consciousness arises, how abstraction and the cognitive abilities we have actually arise, very difficult questions. But, one must, in a naturalistic framework, one must assume that there is a biological framework there that permits the emergence of these traits. And so he's very interested in evolution of mind. Even early on, in the origin, when he's talking about, he uses domestication as an analogy for selection in nature, and he recognizes that even behaviors can be shaped by selection. So, for example, he would point to certain breeds of dog that we can selectively breed for pointers, for example, retrievers, herding dogs, right? That have certain types of behaviors that are clearly heritable, right? And then applying this to people, elements of mind must also be heritable. And so, in the Descent of Man, but also in the expression of the emotions in man and animals, which is a kind of follow-up volume to the Descent. You can almost see them as a two, kind of twin volumes. Comes out a year later. He is keen to try to understand or find evidence for the natural or animal origins of virtually every aspect of emotion, cognition, feeling, all of those things. And he starts in a very natural place. He makes detailed observations of his own infant children, right? From the time they're little babies, he's keeping detailed records of their behavior and trying to see that through the lens of a kind of naturalism, that they are going through a developmental metamorphosis, right? But in their earliest days, months, years, they are reflecting more closely fundamental, basal aspects that would reveal our the animal origins or links of aspects of our emotion and cognition. So you can see, almost observing human development from infancy to adult, you can almost see that as an analog or a parallel with looking at embryological development. All right, each stage may be saying something about relationships with other groups of organisms.
Mhm. So can we say that he was already doing some sort of early version of comparative psychology?
Yes, yes, I think we certainly can. I think that many would suggest that Darwin originates this idea that we would call evolutionary psychology today, which is to understand the nature of mind in an evolutionary context.
Mhm. And when it comes to sex differences specifically, did he try to explain some of the sex differences in psychological traits through sexual selection?
He did, and so it's interesting. I mean, just as we can say that Darwin at times saw, a kind of hierarchy in cultural groups, in ethno or racial groups, you could see again, and we can interpret this in terms of a very particular cultural bias prevailing at the time. I think he would also tend to see gender differences in a bit of a hierarchical context. But his naturalistic interpretation of that, which we wouldn't agree with today, would turn on the idea of what kind of selection dynamic was occurring, the kind of male competition versus, male choice or female choice dynamic he thought would naturally give rise to very different mental traits as well as the physical traits. And so he would attribute, for example, aspects of, very what we might say are rather stereotyped ideas about aggressive males, highly competitive, but he would carry that over to much more inventive and much more, all of these kind of stereotypical ideas about a greater cognitive ability, greater powers of abstract thought and reasoning, greater skills and all of these measures, greater than females. Right, the idea being that females, the women, would not have been subjected to the same kind of selection dynamic, and so those particular traits wouldn't have been honed, with females, and obviously not ideas that that really have much currency today. But you can very much see, it was easy for Darwin to see that as naturally following from the way he was envisioning selection would work. But we could also perhaps see that maybe he's a bit too constrained, or maybe more than he realizes, constrained by the very particulars of his time and place, because this is the prevailing cultural bias, of course. And then it becomes a kind of self-fulfilling, kind of loop where enforced cultural differences and stratifying society and forcing people into different roles can then be both justified by and being used to justify, some of the naturalistic arguments. And it can go in a vicious cycle, actually. And I think we still contend with that today, of course.
Mhm. Yeah, but even if some of these ideas surrounding gender differences followed along these cultural biases and stereotypes that were prevalent in the day, isn't it the case that, for example, nowadays in disciplines like evolutionary psychology, we apply some of those principles to try to understand some of the differences we find between men and women in psychological traits. So, I'm trying to ask you if perhaps some of that could still be valid.
Well, some of it is still, those are questions that are still being asked and debated. The word valid maybe not altogether appropriate because they are debated, right? But I think you're right that that in this subdiscipline of evolutionary psychology, absolutely, there are efforts to use the evolutionary ideas to better understand, what may or may not be these differences in human psychology. And that's where some of the debate lies. To what extent are we seeing meaningful biological differences, and to what extent are they really not meaningful differences? And that's an important question because, for their to the extent to which there may be meaningful biological differences, you can ask questions about the evolutionary processes that might have given rise to meaningful biological differences. But if in psychological cognitive terms, if there are no such actual differences, if they're not real, then you're barking up the wrong tree. You're asking the wrong kinds of questions. And I think that's precisely the nature of the debate, that it's quite difficult actually to really pin down to what extent some of these differences are apparent only. They're not actual differences in cognition, say between ethno or racial groups, or between men and women. And so it's, but I guess the short answer to your question would be yes, that evolutionary psychology today does attempt in that Darwinian tradition to understand apparent or perceived differences. Whether or not they may be real can be debated in evolutionary terms.
Right. And going back to some of the differences between Darwin and Wallace, wasn't it the case that they also differed in how they tried to understand where our human mental faculties came from?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, this was a major point of disagreement between Darwin and Wallace, and because Wallace, actually, by the late 1860s, he had come to the view that the human mind could not arise through a process of natural selection. And of course, for Darwin and his close supporters, this was a major breach. Would undermine, perhaps it could be used as ammunition to undermine the entire framework of evolutionary change. And so they debated this, and Wallace's idea. There's an irony, in a way. Wallace's argument is interesting in that he was almost being more Darwinian than Darwin in trying to be true to natural selection and saying that all change must be attributable to natural selection. And therefore, there's a very particular kind of process of change that we should see. And this must also mean that at every step in a kind of evolutionary chain of change, we have the particular circumstance, the structure, the abilities, whatever they are, useful in their time and place to those individuals that have those traits. But he disagreed with Darwin and many of his contemporaries over this perceived hierarchy in cognitive ability among different groups of people. And so we mentioned earlier how it was very common in the 19th century to see different ethnic groups, racial groups, in terms of a kind of cognitive hierarchy. And of course, it was very Eurocentric, and very white. This would be at the top of the hierarchy, and other groups would always be some, lesser form of this. Wallace disagreed with this for the most part. And one reason for this may be that in his very close association with working with indigenous peoples in Southeast Asia, also in Amazonia. I mean, he had he had lived among people. They were his closest research assistants in the field. He owed his life on more than one occasion to his indigenous assistants. That he had a sense of their intrinsic ability, their cognitive capacity, and he truly believed that very much as we would today, that the human mind is such that any one of those individuals, from say the jungles of Borneo, given the opportunity and given some time, could learn, differential calculus, could learn to be great composers in the European tradition, that have all of these abilities, right? Full ability of abstraction and everything else. And, therefore it raised the question, it flew in the face of the perceived hierarchy. And so the idea would be, if you have indigenous peoples living as, say, hunter-gatherers in parts of the world that would have this amazing ability of their minds, and yet they, in all of evolutionary time, never had any opportunity to exercise these abilities, how then do you explain that by an evolutionary gradualism, right? Seemingly, this amazing cognitive ability is inherent to humans, and it represents a break between humans and the non-human world of primates. And therefore, this kind of fed into Wallace's growing interest in spiritualism, which he approached as a naturalist, actually, and he really got to thinking that natural selection, since it compelled stepwise gradual change where every step of the process must be useful to its possessor, then this extreme ability of the brain that could never be of any use, those abilities could never be of any use to hunter-gatherers, let's say. So then we cannot explain them as having arisen in this gradual context. Now, we wouldn't fully agree with the interpretation of gradualism and all of that today, but you can see that it led Wallace down this argument that suggested that there is a fundamental disconnect, this break between the human mind and the rest of the, let's say, the organic origins of humans. So Wallace never denied that humans descended from other primates, that our physical origins were very clearly, we had an evolution, but then he believed at some point selection stopped acting on our bodies and began to perhaps act on the mind, and that was one step away from then saying, no, there's a complete break between the ability of the mind and the physical evolution of the body, something that Darwin very much disagreed with.
Mhm. So, since we're talking also about how humans evolved from other primate species, was it that back then Darwin, Wallace, or other evolutionary theorists were already talking about other hominin species apart from Homo sapiens? I mean, I'm not sure how much they knew back then about
Mm.
other species and to what extent they had already uncovered fossil remains. I know that paleoanthropology flourished mostly in the 20th century, so but were they already talking about other hominin species?
Not as such. So the Neanderthal fossils, as we would call them now, were first being described, say, in the 1850s. And there was even some debate. I mean, these were recognized as a kind of archaic human. That was a common interpretation. Was it a different species of human? That came a bit later, I believe. the so-called Cro-Magnon man, which I believe is more Homo sapiens, not or I'm unclear at the moment on the taxonomy there. If Cro-Magnon is considered a different species, but that was also being described around this time, and I think it's the beginning of the discussion about archaic human or hominid forms. And I'm not sure that, yeah, it took some time to begin to think of them in terms of altogether different species, which would have been, quite a leap of insight to begin to think in terms of multiple human species that might have existed.
Mhm. And what about human culture? Did Darwin back then had any form of cultural evolution in his theory?
Yes, in the Dissent, and really as part of his discussion of trying to understand the evolution of mind and culture goes hand in hand with humans, the physical evolution of humans, and he did try to understand, and he tried to fit into a kind of selection dynamic, this idea of cultural evolution, and again, very understandable given. Um, he's the originator of the, co-originator of the idea of natural selection, that it has a competition dynamic and all of that. He sees this in competition terms. In fact, Malthus himself, who is an inspiration for Darwin as well as Wallace, in discussing the struggle for existence, his main examples were, it was competition between groups of people, between societies, between cultures. And I think that Darwin very much saw, cultural evolution in that context. What went hand in hand with that would be language, would be cultural institutions like religion, would be cultural traditions, would be tool use or invention, a certain inventiveness, and but he does seem to suggest, he doesn't use this term, but he does sort of imply that his discussion seems to shift from the usual very individual level selection to more of a group dynamic. And you get a sense of a model of cultural evolution in more of a group selection dynamic, that certain societies, let's say starting with tribes to, small societies, bigger societies, city-states, that they can themselves as almost as units can differentially survive, reproduce, outcompete other city-states or other tribes, and in that way export their own culture, right? Spread their own, and there is very much an element of that dynamic in human evolution, the cultural evolution. So I think that he did intuitively see that there would be a group selection dynamic operating in cultural evolution, and I think that there would be a lot of agreement with that today.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it the case that group selection is still highly debated nowadays? Because I know I've already had on the show people like David Sloan Wilson, who is one of the most prominent proponents of group selection, and group selection in terms of genetic group selection, really, because there are people that, for example, agree that cultural group selection is a thing, but they don't really think that when it comes to genetic evolution, we have group selection. So, in terms of
Yeah.
how Darwin thought about group selection, does it translate into how people debate it nowadays or not?
Um, I think you're right that this might turn on maybe human cultural evolution, maybe being a special case of a form of group selection dynamic, because it is debated to what extent the genetically based group selection might be an important phenomenon in biology. But there is work, and David Sloan Wilson's work is exemplifies it, not just theoretical but empirical data to suggest that in certain contexts this dynamic can occur. One way to look at it, it's been called trait group selection, where it is individuals that have certain traits that are able to better maybe augment the performance of individuals in groups better than other groups that have those traits at a lower frequency, and those would be genetically based traits. Therefore, you get a greater export of these traits from the more productive group. And so a trait group dynamic is a form of group selection. So that's been sort of demonstrated theoretically. There's some suggestion, some empirical data that this can occur in certain contexts. But how general it may be, I think that it's probably fair to say most evolutionary biologists would not say that it was important, general. It doesn't generally occur, but that it can happen in certain contexts. There are other ways to look at group selection, and this is another area of great debate, and that is to the extent to which you can disentangle group selection from kin selection, because groups often do consist of related individuals. Kin selection, what might be called inclusive fitness theory, was a kind of intuitive insight of Darwin's, and then greatly elaborated and in the 20th century. But so there's a debate about to what extent can we, mathematically or otherwise, disentangle the group selection dynamic and inclusive fitness from a group selection that might be based on traits, but not close relatedness on average between individuals.
Mhm. Isn't that something that, gets manifested really well when it comes to the eusocial insects, because they are highly genetically related, and so, but they are composed. Their groups are really big. So would that be a case of kin selection or group selection, right?
Well, the standard interpretation is that these eusocial species arise through a kin selection process, because these tend to be, by and large, they tend to be family societies, even if they're very, very large. Now,
Yeah.
there's plenty of evidence to show that there can be a lot of admixture. We can get fusion of unrelated families. You can actually have, multiple mating, so that you can actually have a lot more diversity within a colony than was believed to be the case, maybe 30 years ago or so. But nonetheless, the idea would be that in the evolution of eusociality, we're talking about family societies. And this was something that Darwin addressed. He was trying to understand, first of all, the evolution of sterility, which itself would fly in the face of a natural selection process that is that is putting a premium on individual reproductive success. But he could understand intuitively in terms of helping the group, the family, and in so doing, giving up its own reproduction, but gaining through the reproduction of the close relatives that those individuals assist. Right. But more than that, he was very interested in trying to understand the morphological diversity that you get within a family. And it's really pretty astounding if you think about it. So how do you have seemingly almost genetically identical individuals. Think about, say, a soldier termite and a worker termite or something, morphologically radically different. So that was part of his conundrum, was sterility, this tremendous caste differentiation. It was all of a piece for Darwin. But I think it's fair to say that his insight into seeing that genetic relatedness, the family context, was key. That certainly has held water, right? That carries right through into the 20th century, into today, where we see the inclusive fitness or kin selection dynamic as beautifully elaborated by Bill Hamilton and others, as lying at the heart of the origin anyway of eusociality. And of course, there is some debate because it may be difficult to always disentangle this group selection dynamic from what may be happening in a kin selection context. And there's, I think, lots of efforts to try to mathematically treat them separately, the different aspects of a single process. And so you might have maybe most of the, I dare say that most biologists studying this area would put a premium on the genetic or sort of kin selection aspect of the dynamic. And then you have others like Ed Wilson in recent years that would say we're maybe putting too much emphasis on that, and that the other part of this equation, the kind of group selection dynamic, is more important than we realize.
Mhm. So just one last question, and just to try to summarize what we've been talking about today and focusing mostly on the descent of man, what would you say were the things that Darwin got right and the ones that he got wrong?
Mm. Well, of course, phrasing this in terms of what one got right or wrong can be a bit fraught, right?
Mhm.
Because there can be elements of both. You can be right for the wrong reasons. You can be partially right and maybe on the right track. So there is some nuance there. There is some nuance. But we might fairly say that we would fully agree with Darwin, of course, about the reality of this process we call natural selection, about the fundamental unity of life on Earth, right? The great tree of life, the relationship of all species, and the relationship of all of the different branches of humanity. Fundamentally, one people, one species, in all of its wonderful diversification. The dynamic, the particulars of the dynamic, we could say, well, we don't fully agree. He placed too much emphasis on, say, speciation in place, sympatric speciation. Many biologists would say it happens, but it's not that important. It's more isolation, speciation with physical separation is absolutely critical, So we would disagree with Darwin about that, for example. With the descent of man and sexual selection, we would say, modern biologists would say, absolutely, very important distinction between intrasexual selection and intersexual selection. And we can see how these play out and give you very different forms of sexual dimorphism. Now, where might we disagree? Well, there's some debate over, so for example, looking at processes like female choice or male choice, is choice purely aesthetic? Is it simply based on nothing but a kind of, cognitive whim? Or are traits being chosen linked to traits that are important in fitness? Are they indicators of vigor, of health, of robustness, and therefore, is, for example, vibrancy of color that may be so attractive? Is that so attractive because it's also been a proxy for a certain intrinsic vigor of the individual and a healthiness, and that might translate into a greater reproductive success? This is debated some today with most biologists. I think it's fair to say, saying disagreeing with Darwin and saying these traits are generally linked in some way to fitness. And then some saying, no, we think Darwin, had it right, that maybe they had nothing to do with fitness and it was all about, just pure aesthetics. And of course, this is a semantic argument too, because one could say by its very definition, even if it's purely aesthetic, that's fitness, right? If you're making the choice systematically, reproductive choices, it doesn't matter what it's based on. If that's consistent and systematic, well, that's fitness too, right? It doesn't have to be linked to, the major histocompatibility complex or anything like that. There are probably other examples, I'm sure, that I could come up with for you.
Okay, great. So just before we go, Dr. Costa, where can people find your work on the internet?
Oh, yeah. If people are interested, I keep up with ResearchGate. All of my papers are available there, and those that are freely available can be downloaded. And those that are in copyright with a personal request, I'm happy to send papers. My books, of course, are readily available. I've published with been fortunate to work with Harvard University Press and W. Norton, University of Chicago Press, now most recently Princeton University Press. And so through those presses or through other booksellers, my books are available. Google Scholar is another way to learn about my work. My faculty website certainly has a listing of papers. So yeah, there's a trail out there.
Okay, great. So it's been a pleasure to talk to you, Dr. Costa. Thank you for taking the time to come on the show.
Oh, likewise. It's been a real pleasure, Ricardo. I greatly appreciate the invitation. It was fun.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've been doing the channel for more than 3 years now, and it is thanks to people like you that it's been running for so long. And so, if you like what I'm doing, please pay a visit to my Patreon page or to PayPal. All of the links are in the description box of the interview, and to consider making a pledge there, support the show. And otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share the interview, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and supporters, Karen Litska and Blanchett Pereira Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollesy, Enric Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingart, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetriou, Robert Windager, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zoop, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Yevon Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librand, Oslam Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londoño Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Miran B., Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Max Bailby, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Horowitz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Elman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmides, Saima Afzal. My producers is Web, Jim Frank, Lucas Tafinia, Kian Gilligan, Sergio Adriano, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardus France, and Niruban Balachandran, and my executive producers, Michelle Rugieski, Rosie James Pratt, and Matthew Lavender. Thank you for all.